G'day, this is Chris Savage from Ariel Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Minor Prophets. Thank you for coming along, and I pray this will be a benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Well, thanks for coming along this session. We're in the book of Zechariah, and we're looking at Zechariah chapter 9, verse 1 to Zechariah 10:7. In the last session, we covered the question as to whether the fasts that were being practiced should continue. Should fasting of the fifth month be continued? That's July, August. That's the 9th of Av, AV. This has become the second most important fast day in Judaism today. Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement, is the most important. Now, in Zechariah's day, the question was asked because they were fasting because of the destruction of the city and the temple by the Babylonians. So they were fasting for about 69 years. And there's another fast. They're doing the fast of Gedaliah, which was observed in the 7th month of Tishri. Gedaliah, remember, was the governor of Jerusalem appointed by the Babylonians, but he was assassinated. And God asked a question of them. He says, did you at all fast unto me, even to me? So what he's saying is, who did you fast for? Their fasts were not for the Lord. In fact, these fasts in the 5th and 7th months were never commanded by God. They were instituted by the people because Jerusalem was destroyed and because Gedaliah was assassinated. Now, Jerusalem was destroyed because of disobedience to the prophets. And God says, had they obeyed the prophets, the question of fasting would never have come up. He's saying to them, why concern yourselves with that which was not commanded, when there's lots of things, there's plenty of stuff that was commanded, which you need to be concerned about. So what we saw was that rejection of the prophets resulted in their rejection by God, and judgment came. And when they cried to God, he did not respond. And eventually they were scattered, partially in the Babylonian captivity, but the final fulfillment in the scattering will be in the future in AD 70. It was AD 70, almost 2,000 years ago. But God said he will return to Jerusalem. He will come and dwell in Jerusalem. And that's when Messiah will come and rule from Jerusalem. And so there's going to be, according to Zechariah, there's going to be a future restoration and prosperity for Jerusalem. So the message to Zechariah's generation was listen to the prophets, obey the prophets. Remember, the prophets were the ones who were bringing the word of God to the people. And God will bring about a good to Jerusalem and Judah. Regarding the fast, God had not commanded these fasts. So what they do regarding these fasts for now does not matter to him. All of these fasts will someday be turned into feasting. And because of this, the statement to them was to therefore love, truth, and peace. So that was covering up just quickly what we did in the last session. And now we're moving into chapter 9, verse 1 to chapter 10, verse 7. Now we see the first burden of the word of Jehovah in the book of Zechariah. And this is covered in chapter 9, verse 1 to chapter 11, 17. Chapter 9 to 14 deals with two burdens. The first is what we're going to look at in the first burden is chapter 9 to 11. That's one unit of prophecy. The second burden covers chapters 12 to 14, and they are also another unit of prophecy given to Zechariah. Now, before examining the first burden, we're just going to summarize it in 3 points. First of all, he talks about Israel's rejection of the true shepherd and the subsequent turning over of all Israel to the Gentiles. And the Gentiles are now used to punish Israel for rejecting their true shepherd. Second, he points out that there will be judgment upon the Gentile world. And third, Israel will be strengthened to withstand the Gentile invasion onto her physical and spiritual redemption comes by means of the true shepherd. Now, these are the 3 basic points that this first burden of Jehovah makes. Now, Zechariah doesn't necessarily deal with them in this order there, but this is a basic summary. In the first of these burdens, we'll see how Zechariah prophesies the conquests of Alexander the Great in chapter 9. Here we see now the burden. This is chapter 9, verse 1. We just get a chapter 9, verse 1 to 4 first. The burden of the word of Jehovah upon the land of Hadrach and Damascus shall be its resting place. For the eye of man and of all the tribes of Israel is toward Jehovah. And Hamath also, which bordereth thereon, Tyre and Sidon, because they are very wise. And Tyre did build herself a stronghold, and heaped up silver as the dust, and fine gold as the mire of the streets. Behold, the Lord will dispossess her, and he will smite her power in the sea, and she shall be devoured with fire. Now, these verses here, these are prophesying the conquests of Alexander the Great, which he fulfills in the year 332 BC. 332 BC. It starts out with the burden of the word of Jehovah, and this again is the first of two such burdens, and this is with the second one coming in chapters 12 to 14. So as he begins describing the conquest of Alexander the Great, Zechariah enumerates the area geographically, beginning with Syria. He says, when this burden comes, it comes upon the land of Hadrach, which is another name for the land of Syria. And then he moves into the capital city of Syria, which is Damascus, because being the capital city, Alexander would be heading for it. And the text says, Damascus shall be its resting place. In other words, Damascus is the goal of this burden. It's the goal of the conquest of Alexander the Great as far as Syria is concerned. Then he makes a bit of a parenthetical statement here. For the eye of man and of all the tribes of Israel is towards Jehovah. So this parenthetical statement is emphasizing that God is in control. And it is something which Israel at that time clearly recognizes. Then he gives another geographical point also in Syria, and that is Hamath, which bordereth thereon. Hamath borders the area controlled by the city of Damascus within the land of Syria. The next country he now turns to is Phoenicia, which we see in the second part of verse 2 and down to verse 4. The two key cities of Phoenicia were Tyre and Sidon, and both of which are mentioned here. Now, God also allows them to be invaded by the armies of Alexander the Great because he says they are very wise. Now, this has a rhetorical meaning. It's expressing the thought that they are very wise in their own eyes. They're just so wise. Then he focuses on Tyre alone and says, Tyre did build herself a stronghold. Now, originally, the city of Tyre was on the coastline of Phoenicia. It was on the land, but this was not a very defensible position. And so it was easily taken captive. So what they did was they moved the city off the coast and they rebuilt on an island about 800 meters offshore. And this island stronghold had a double wall 45 meters high, as well as sea on every side. And that made the island Tyre virtually impregnable. Imagine 45-meter walls, 45 meters high. Isaiah 23 verse 4 makes a similar mention of this of Tyre. Now Shalmaneser, who was the emperor of Assyria, besieged it for 5 years and he couldn't take it. And then along came Nebuchadnezzar and he besieged it for 13 years and couldn't take it. Something else also, Tyre stored up silver and gold in abundance. She heaped up silver as the dust and fine gold as the dirt of the streets. And this is also pointed out by Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 1 to 5. So here we have this virtually impregnable island city. But now comes God's judgment. And he says three things. First, he says the Lord will dispossess her. And secondly, he will smite her power in the sea. And third, she shall be devoured by fire. So the fulfillment of this did come to pass. Instead of trying to besiege the city by using his navy, what Alexander did was he built a causeway using the ruins of the old Tyre, which was on the coastline, and he built it from the shore out to the island. And it apparently can still be seen there today. And what he did was he then besieged the city, and after only 7 months, it fell. Remember, this is God's judgment now upon this city. So when it was taken, 8,000 residents were killed by the sword, 2,000 were crucified, 13,000 were sold into slavery, and what was left was burned. And this is all in fulfillment of prophecy, of this particular prophecy. In verses 5 to 7, Zechariah now turns to Philistia, and there is a bit of an interplay here between 4 of the 5 Philistine cities, or Philistine cities. Verse 5, Ashkelon shall see it and fear, Gaza also, and shall be sore pained, and Ekron for her expectation shall be put to shame. And the king shall perish from Gaza, and Ashkelon shall not be inhabited. And the bastard shall dwell in Ashdod, and I will cut off the pride of the Philistines, and I will take away his blood out of his mouth, and his abominations from between his teeth. And he also shall be a remnant for our God, and he shall be as a chieftain in Judah, and Ekron as a Jebusite. Now, remember, the Philistines did not have one single king. Remember, it had 5 kings ruling in what was known as the Philistine Pentapolis. Zechariah deals with 4 of these royal Philistine cities. First of all, concerning Ashkelon, he says 2 things. He says, Ashkelon shall see it and fear. Now, when Ashkelon sees that Phoenicia could not withstand Alexander the Great, and especially when the Greek armies overran Tyre, fear now grips Ashkelon. Next, their fear is well founded because Zechariah says, Ashkelon shall not be inhabited. So Alexander will definitely destroy the city. And then secondly, he deals with Gaza. And he says 2 things about Gaza. They will be sore pained. And why? Because they'll also be attacked. And the king shall perish from Gaza. So in the fulfillment of this prophecy against the Philistine area, Alexander besieged Gaza for 2 months. Finally, he captured it and took the king of Gaza, whose name was Batis, B-A-T-I-S, and tied him to a chariot and had him dragged to death behind it. And he killed 10,000 residents, and the rest of them were enslaved. Third city he deals with is Ekron, and he says 2 things about it. First of all, he says her expectation shall be put to shame. Now, her expectation was that Tyre, that island city, would withstand the siege of Alexander. Then he would not be able to proceed southward to Gaza. She thought she was safe. But their expectation was dashed because when Alexander did succeed in taking Tyre. Secondly, Ekron would be as a Jebusite. A strange thing to say. Ekron would be as a Jebusite. Now, remember, the Jebusites were the people who originally held Jerusalem until King David took it from them. And this means that Ekron would also be conquered, become a servant, and finally disappear. Furthermore, Any Jebusites who were left in the land when King David took it over, and then later on, any Jebusites who were left were actually incorporated into Israel, according to Joshua 15:63, Joshua 15:63, 2 Samuel 5:6-9, 2 Samuel 5:6-9, and 1 Kings 9:20-21, 1 Kings 9:20-21. So the Ekronites were eventually incorporated into Israel. Now, as for the fourth city, which is Ashdod, the prophet simply says, a bastard shall dwell in Ashdod. This means a bastard or an illegitimate race of people will live there. And we see this fulfilled in Nehemiah 4, verse 7, and Nehemiah 13, verse 24. He next deals with the Philistines as a whole and points out four things. First, in the second part of verse 6, I will cut off the pride of the Philistines. The Philistine nation came to an end. And second, her idolatry will cease. And that we have two statements here referring to idolatry. First of all, he says, I will take away his blood out of his mouth. Now, this refers to the practice of drinking the blood of sacrifices as an act of worship, or of eating the victims with the blood. It's a practice strictly forbidden to the Israelites. Second, and his abominations from between his teeth. And this is probably a reference to temple prostitution. Now, all of this means that idolatry is going to be cut off, or will be cut off. Third, he shall be a remnant for our God. So what he's saying here is that some Philistines will be saved and incorporated into Israel. And fourth, he shall be as a chieftain in Judah. So during the course of time, some Philistines will have a degree of leadership. And the only Philistine city not mentioned here in this judgment is the city called Gath. That was one of the five, because by this time, Gath has already been incorporated into Israel. And we see the protection of Jerusalem in chapter 9, verse 8. And I will encamp about my house against the army, that none pass through or return, and no oppressor shall pass through them any more. For now have I seen with mine eyes. Now, in verse 8 here, God makes a promise. And what he promises here is that no matter what happens to these other places when captured by Alexander the Great, he will protect Jerusalem from destruction. Now, the first part of verse 8 was fulfilled in the time of Alexander, where he says, I will encamp about my house against the army. God will not allow Alexander to destroy either Jerusalem or the temple. And this was fulfilled. And there is both history and legend connected with it. Now, legend says that as Alexander and his army were approaching Jerusalem, intending to destroy it, the high priest in his priestly garb came out to meet him. And suddenly, when Alexander saw him, he fell to his knees. Now, this was a great surprise to his generals, but he later explained to them why he did it. In the legend, we are told that before he had left Macedonia to embark on his conquests, Alexander had a dream in which he had seen a man dressed in the kind of clothing the high priest was wearing. And a voice had said to him, according to the legend, when you see this, fall on your knees. So when he saw the high priest coming to meet him, he obeyed the voice he had heard in his dream and fell on his knees. Now, this part is legendary. But historically, Alexander did not destroy Jerusalem. He did not put Jerusalem under direct tribute, but he did allow the high priest to become the ruler over the city and subject to Greek authority. Then he says, and the prophet Zechariah says, none shall pass through or return. Now, Alexander did not enslave Jerusalem, neither did he return to put the city under any kind of severe tribute. Now, the second part of verse 8, this now awaits a future fulfillment in the millennium, where he says, no oppressor shall pass through them anymore. So there have been lots of oppressors since Alexander's day. So this part of the verse could only be fulfilled in the Messianic kingdom. And you can have a look at that in Isaiah chapter 60, verse 18. Isaiah 60, verse 18. Now, the second thing, for now, I have seen with mine eyes, is a reference to the way the eyes of God will look upon Jerusalem to make sure that both the near prophecy about Alexander and the far prophecy in the millennium will both be fulfilled. Now we see the coming in of the king in chapter 9, verses 9 to 10. This is a very familiar passage. In these two verses, we have a messianic prophecy. And as Zechariah switches from the Greek king of verses 1 to 8 to the Jewish king of verses 9 to 10. Verse 9 deals with the first coming of Messiah, while verse 10 deals with the second coming of Messiah. Here we see the first coming in verse 9. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king comes unto you. He's just and having salvation, lowly and riding upon an ass, even upon a colt, the foal of an ass. Now here we have an example of one of 4 different types of messianic prophecy. This type actually blends the first and second comings into one picture. This is verses 9 to 10. So he begins verse 9 with a call to rejoice on account of the first coming. He says, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion, shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. They're not to fear. And the reason they should be glad and shout is, for your king comes unto you. Notice he says here, your king. It's a Jewish king. This is not a Greek king. This is not the Greek king he's talking about. He's talking about a Jewish king. He's coming to you, not coming against you. Messiah is not coming against the Jews, but he's coming for the Jews. This is the first coming. And then he gives us a description of this king and says 3 things about him. First of all, he says he is just. He's characterized by righteousness. And this is a point also made by Jeremiah chapter 23, verses 5 to 6. Alexander the Great, he died in a drunken stupor. He was never characterized by righteousness. Second, this Jewish king has salvation. He has deliverance, whereas Alexander brought death and destruction. Third, he is lowly. And this word in Hebrew means to be brought low by oppression. So the Messiah was oppressed, as we read in Isaiah 53, verse 7. Now, Alexander came on the scene with great pomp and all the trappings of earthly power, but not so the Jewish king. In verse 9, we have the manner of his coming. He'll be riding upon an ass, even upon a colt, the foal of an ass. Now, the word foal refers to an ass that has not yet been broken in, and that's exactly what Jesus rode into Jerusalem upon an unbroken donkey. Yet this unbroken donkey didn't try to buck him off. Alexander is known to have ridden upon a white steed, a white horse. Now, fulfillment of Messiah's first coming like this is seen in Matthew 21, verses 1 to 11. Now, specifics that are fulfilled in the Gospels are, first of all, he is Zion's Jewish king. We find it in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. Second, he came onto and for the Jews in John 1:11. Third, he is just, affirmed in Isaiah 53:11. Fourth, he's lowly, affirmed by Isaiah 53:2. And fifth, he has salvation, affirmed by Isaiah 53:11. Now we see the second coming in chapter 9, verse 10. And I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall speak peace unto the nations, and his dominion shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. Now in verse 10, Zechariah deals with the second coming and points out three things relevant to it. First of all, this will mean that all instruments of war will be removed from Israel. I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off. Now, you know, Ephraim represents the northern kingdom. It's the largest tribe in the northern kingdom, while Jerusalem, the southern kingdom of Judah. You know, both are united under the rule of the king who is Messiah. Second, Messiah will cause peace to become worldwide. He shall speak peace to the nations. And third, he will set up his messianic rule. Why? Because his dominion shall be from sea to sea. Now, this refers to both the eastern and western borders of the land. This is the land of Israel. The first sea is on the east, which is the Dead Sea. The other sea is on the west and is the Mediterranean Sea, which you will see in Exodus chapter 23, verse 31. Exodus 23, verse 31. His dominion will also be from the river onto the ends of the earth. Now, the river here means the Euphrates River, because the Euphrates River defines the northern border of the promised land. Now, although according to the Abrahamic covenant, one would expect to read that the southern border would be the brook of Egypt, instead, Zechariah says it will be onto the ends of the earth. So he's pointing out here that primarily, while Messiah will be ruling personally in and over Israel from Jerusalem, at the same time, he will rule the entire world. So Zechariah looks at his dominion as spreading beyond the southern border to cover the entire world. And this section is a quotation from Psalm 72, verse 8, which also describes Messiah's rule. So here we have an example of two types of messianic prophecy. Some see Messiah as a suffering, lowly, humble, and dying. Others picture him as conquering and ruling. Now, when the rabbis looked at these apparently contradictory prophecies, they came up with a two Messiah solution. What they said was that the first Messiah would come, whom they called the son of Joseph, Messiah, the son of Joseph, and that one would fulfill the suffering passages. Now, he's going to be followed by Messiah, the son of David, and he'll be the conquering Messiah. Now, that's the way that they see the two Messiah theories. But the New Testament solution is much simpler than that. There's only one Messiah who comes to earth twice, once to die and be resurrected, and then to come again to rule. Now, another rabbinic tradition, or another rabbinic explanation from ancient times is as follows. Rabbi Joseph, the son of Levi, objects that it is written in one place, "Behold, one like the Son of Man comes with the clouds." But in another place it is written, "Lowly and riding upon an ass." The solution is, if they be righteous, he shall come with the clouds of heaven. But if they be not righteous, he shall come lowly, riding upon an ass. Now, the second type of rabbinic explanation is to point out that either one or the other type will be fulfilled. What they say, this other type of explanation here says that if Israel is righteous, well, he will come riding on the clouds and fulfill all those prophecies. But if Israel is sinful, he will come riding upon an ass. So, in the rabbinic view, Messiah will fulfill either or, but not both. The Bible, however, demands that both types of prophecy be fulfilled. So it is better to see one Messiah that comes twice. Now in verses chapter 9:11 to chapter 10:12, we see the redemption, salvation, and restoration of Israel. We see the redemption of Israel. As for you also, because of the blood of your covenant, I have set free your prisoners from the pit wherein is no water. Turn you to the stronghold, you prisoners of hope. Even today do I declare that I will render double unto you. For I have bent Judah for me. I have filled the bow with Ephraim, and I will stir up your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece, and will make you as the sword of a mighty man. And Jehovah shall be seen over them, and his arrow shall go forth as the lightning, and the Lord Jehovah will blow the trumpet, and will go down and will go with whirlwinds of the south. Verse 15. Jehovah of hosts will defend them, and they shall devour and shall tread down the sling stones, and they shall drink and make a noise as through wine, and they shall be filled like bowls, like the corners of the altar. And Jehovah their God will save them in that day as the flock of his people, for they shall be as the stones of a crown, lifted on high over his land. For how great is his goodness, and how great is his beauty. Grain shall make the young men flourish, and new wine the virgins. So as Zechariah deals with the salvation, redemption, and restoration of Israel in this section, he begins with redemption in verses 11 to 17. And the purpose of this section is to give a fuller exposition of how verse 10 is going to be fulfilled in its relationship to Israel. In verses 11 to 12, his point is that Israel is going to be freed. And the basis of that is in verse 11, according to your covenant, which is a reference to the foundational Abrahamic covenant. As for you also, that is, as for Israel, because of the blood of your covenant. Now, the Abrahamic covenant was a blood covenant. It was signed and sealed by the shedding of blood in Genesis 15, verses 18 to 20. On that basis, God says, I will set free the prisoners from the pit wherein there is no water. Pits without water were usually dry cisterns, which were sometimes used as prisons. It was this kind of pit that Joseph was put into by his brothers prior to being sold. And that was in Genesis 37:24. Also, Jeremiah was thrown into one in Jeremiah 38:6. So in this passage here, Jews confined to this kind of pit are going to be freed on the basis of the Abrahamic covenant. And just as in the book of Exodus, God intended to free Israel from Egypt on this same basis, so will be their future deliverance. Now in verse 12, he points out that there is a principle of rendering double for Israel's sins. So he says to those who have been released, turn ye to the stronghold, ye prisoners of hope. Stronghold is a place of safety, and that's Jerusalem. Captives who have good hope of deliverance because they are still in covenant with God. Now, the concept of doubling relates both to punishment and to blessing. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 2, and Jeremiah 16, verse 18, bring out the doubling of punishment for Israel's sins. Isaiah 61:7 brings out the doubling of Israel's blessings. So this principle of doubling belongs to the blessing of the firstborn. And since Israel is the firstborn among the nations, according to Exodus chapter 4, verses 22 to 23, God applies this principle. So God says, even today do I declare that I will render double unto you. Now in verse 13, He points out that God is going to empower Israel to withstand the Gentiles. I have bent Judah for me. Judah has become like a bent bow in God's hand so as to be able to shoot his arrows. I have filled the bow with Ephraim. So Judah is the bow and Ephraim is the arrow aimed at their enemies. And I will stir up your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece. So God on one hand addresses Zion and on the other hand, Greece, showing that he rules all people. Now we saw a similar thing happening in the Maccabean Wars, although the ultimate fulfillment of this is still future, because this points towards Israel's final deliverance. He says, I will make you as the sword of a mighty man. And so the picture here is that in the final wars of Israel against the Gentile nations, God will empower and energize the Jews to be able to fight their wars well. Now, Zechariah will detail this once again in chapter 12, verses 1 to 9. It is not really Israel who will ultimately defeat the Gentiles, because in verses 14 to 16 of Zechariah 12, his point is that the Gentiles will be defeated by God himself. Verse 14, here in verse 14, describes God's intervention. First of all, Jehovah will be seen over them. The picture here is of Jehovah hovering over the people, just as in the glory cloud in the wilderness. Second, he says Jehovah is the bowman, the bow, while Judah is the bow and Ephraim is the arrow. God himself is the bowman. Third, the Lord Jehovah will blow the trumpet to stir up their sons to war. Fourth, he will advance with the winds of the south. So these are the hot, withering chum-sin winds which cause people to dry out and become extremely thirsty. So these are some of the means God will use to accomplish his task. And then in verse 15, he describes the defense. Jehovah will defend them. Second, they shall devour and subdue, because with Jehovah defending them, they'll be able to do this. Third, Israel will make a noise as through wine. So Israel will rejoice when they see their enemies defeated. Fourth, they will drink their blood. Now, this is not literally, because that would violate the law. It is in the sense of shedding the blood of those who attacked them. And fifthly, they shall be filled like bowls, like the corners of the altar. And just as the bowls were filled with the blood of the sacrificed animals and then poured out at the corners of the base of the altar, that's like what will happen with the blood of Israel's enemies. Treading down the sling stones, they'll contemptuously trample on the hostile missiles, which shall fall harmlessly under their feet. In verse 16, he spells out their deliverance. First, Jehovah, their God, will save them. So he is the one who will come to their rescue. And second, they shall be as the stones of a crown. So they're going to be lifted on high over his land. And this is in contrast to the worthless sling stones trodden on the foot. These stones are the stones of the crown. These are the gems. Now, on that day, and that day is the day of the Lord. It's a reference to the end time. They're going to be like the flock of his people. So he will tend his people as a shepherd tends his flock. And then finally, in verse 17, there is praise as a result of deliverance. Zechariah points out four things here. First, how great is his goodness? Second, how great is his beauty? How great is the goodness of beauty of God in what he has done? And third, grain shall make the young men flourish. So there's going to be a superabundance of crops. And fourth, and new wine, the virgins. There'll be a time of merrymaking because of God's redemption of Israel. In the salvation of Israel, we see this in verses 1 to 7 of chapter 10. Ask ye of Jehovah rain in the time of the latter rain, even of Jehovah that makes lightnings, and he will give them showers of rain to every one grass in the field. For the teraphim have spoken vanity, and the diviners have seen a lie, and they have told false dreams, they comfort in vain. Therefore they go their way like sheep, they are afflicted because there is no shepherd. Mine anger is kindled against the shepherds, and I will punish the he-goats. For Jehovah of hosts has visited his flock, the house of Judah, and will make them as his goodly horse in the battle. From him shall come forth the cornerstone, from him the nail, from him the battle bow, from him every ruler together. Verse 5. And they shall be as mighty men treading down their enemies in the mire of the streets in the battle. And they shall fight because Jehovah is with them. And the riders and horses shall be confounded. And I will strengthen the house of Judah, and I will save the house of Joseph, and I'll bring them back, for I have mercy upon them. And they shall be as though I had not cast them off, for I am Jehovah their God, and I will hear them. And they of Ephraim shall be like a mighty man, and their heart shall rejoice as through wine. Yea, their children shall see it and rejoice. Their heart shall be glad in Jehovah. In these verses, Zechariah deals with the salvation of Israel, beginning with a promise in verse 1, that when this salvation comes, the blessings of rain will be restored. When the Bible talks about rain in the land of Israel, there are 4 different descriptions of it. There is the former rain, from the Hebrew word yureh, which comes October, November. This is the light, drizzly rain. The second is the Hebrew matar, which is ordinary rain. It just means showers. Third type of rain is geshem, which is heavy rain. And the fourth type is the malkosh, which is the latter rain. Now, the former rain falls in the months of October, November, and then there is a bit of an interchange between ordinary and heavy rain during the months of November, February, and then the latter rain falls during March and April. And then comes the dew season, when no rain falls until the following October. So the prophet discusses these different types of rain as part of Israel's restored blessings. The rain will come in its proper time and in the proper way. He says here in verse 1, ask ye of Jehovah rain in the time of the latter rain. In other words, ask for geshem rain in the time of malkosh. So during March, April, the latter rain begins to peter out. And when it does rain in that period, it is usually only very light showers. But he says to ask for heavy rain in the time of the latter rain, and you'll get it. In other words, ask for a little and you will get much. Then he says, even of Jehovah that makes lightnings. Jehovah is the one who is able to accomplish such things. So he's the one to give them showers of rain. This means he will give them ordinary rain as well. To every one grass in the field. So there'll be enough rain to sustain every single blade of grass throughout the land of Israel. None will dry up because of a lack of rain. And this was a promise in the Mosaic law when it was not a fact at the time. It was clearly stated that there'll be the blessing of rain for obedience and the withholding of rain for disobedience. That's in the Mosaic law in Leviticus. But in the kingdom, they'll receive abundance of rain just for the asking as a result of Israel's salvation. And the promise in the law we see in Leviticus 26, verses 3 to 4, and Deuteronomy 11, 13 to 15. In verse 2, he points out to Israel the failure of both her idolatry and her false prophets. Talking about their sin of idolatry, first of all, he says, for the teraphim have spoken vanity. Remember, the teraphim were these little household gods, and in this idolatry, they had failed. Then he details the failure of the false prophets, First, the diviners have seen a lie. This means that the visions they had seen were deceptive, lying visions. Second, they have told false dreams. They might have been dreaming, but they have not had prophetic dreams from God. And third, they comfort in vain. Why? Because they provide only false comfort, which actually leads to judgment. Now, all of this resulted in a scattering of the flock of Israel. Therefore, they go their way like sheep. They're afflicted because there is no shepherd. Now, because of their false prophets, Israel was scattered. And this is a point Zechariah will later develop in chapter 13, verses 2 to 7. In verse 3, he deals with the failure of Israel's shepherds. Mine anger is kindled against the shepherds. Now, this refers to God's anger against the Jewish leaders because it is they who are guilty of leading the flock astray, and something he's going to develop later on in chapter 11, verses 4 to 14. So he says, I will punish the he-goats. Excuse me. And this is those among the common people who conspired with the leaders to lead the people astray. They're the he-goats. The he-goats head the flock. They who are first in crime will be first in punishment. Now, when the Lord said, I punish the goats, he's talking about the leaders in Israel. They should have been leading their people into the word of God, to the place where they could have peace with God, peace in their own hearts. Instead, what happened was they were false prophets, giving them false comfort, false hopes, and actually leading them away from God. So God said that he was angry with them. Second part of verse 3 to 5, he deals with the fact that Israel will be empowered to withstand the Gentile armies. In verse 3, we have the empowering by God. For Jehovah of hosts has visited his flock, the house of Judah, and will make them as his goodly horse in the battle. Point of these figures is that the Jewish forces will be empowered to withstand their enemy. In verse 4, he focuses his attention upon the Messiah and points out that from him will come four things. First, from him shall come forth the cornerstone. From the house of Judah, the cornerstone is the foundation stone, and Messiah is pictured in scripture as the foundation stone. We can find it in Isaiah chapter 28, verse 16, Isaiah 28, 16, Matthew 21, verse 42, Matthew 21, 42, and Hebrews 7, verse 14. Second thing about the Messiah, from him the nail. Now, this word means a tent peg. In those days, a tent peg was fixed to the main supporting pole in the tent, and a man would then hang his valuables on it. So this is the pole in the middle of the tent that holds the tent up, and the tent peg was fixed to that. The point here is that all that is of value will hang upon the Messiah personally, because he is the nail, from him the nail. Third, from him will come the battle bow. Now, this battle bow refers to the weapon God uses, which is Judah and Ephraim, by whom the false shepherds are going to be removed. Fourth, from him every ruler together. So among those who do have rightful authority over Israel, their source of authority will come from Messiah. In verse 5, we're given the results of the empowering and energizing of Israel. They shall be as a mighty man. This means they'll be victorious in battle, treading down their enemies in the mire of the streets in the battle. Every weapon used against Israel will be made ineffective. And they shall fight because Jehovah is with them. They'll be energized by God, and the riders on horses shall be confounded. Every entity brought against Israel will be neutralized. And finally, in verses 6 to 7, he points out that Israel will be saved. Now, verse 6 deals with the rescuing of Israel, and he says 6 things in this regard. First of all, I will strengthen the house of Judah. Again, this emphasizes that God will energize them. Second, I will save the house of Joseph. So the energizing alone will not deliver them. God himself will deliver them. Third, I will bring them back. God will regather them. Fourth, I'll have mercy upon them. He'll save them spiritually as well. Fifth, they shall be as though I had not cast them off. So Israel will be so restored and so saved that it will appear that they were never cast off or scattered in the past. And sixth, the reason is, for I am Jehovah their God, and I will hear them. So as God is going to rescue Israel in verse 6, that will lead to the results in verse 7. Ephraim shall be like a mighty man. They'll be mighty in battle. Their heart shall rejoice as through wine. So they're going to be joyful over what God has done for them. Yea, their children shall see it and rejoice. So the descendants of those who actually experience the restoration will see it and rejoice. Their hearts shall be glad in Jehovah. So even these descendants who are born throughout the kingdom period will come to saving faith. And that's where we will leave it for this session. So study hard and grow strong. Thanks for coming along.